Greetings all, Shane Bruce, rest of my Daisy, and today we're going to be doing a little detail work on this current buttstock. This is for, I think, gun number 7, maybe number 8. I've kind of lost track of how many I've built now. But part of the process on finishing the buttstock is after you get your profiles installed on it, you know, depending on what you plan to make it look like, you got to pay attention to the details. And one of the details you want to make sure that you eliminate are any cross hatches that have occurred during the cutting process and the raw shaping process. And normally, you know, if you look at anybody else that does videos on finishing gun stocks, you know, by now you probably have a solid understanding that it is a progression of grits. In other words, you start with a heavy grit paper, 60 grit in some cases, 80 grit in our case. We have a very defined progression that we use at Restomod. We start off with roughs on stock, then we get after it with scrapers, and we get after it with a Sureform tool to get the form the way we want it. And then, when it's coming down time to do the final sanding, we start with an 80 grit paper and remove all the previous scratches. Really, the whole objective of the exercise is to get rid of scratches. Now, you notice that little blivet there. That's got to go away. That's not acceptable. Now, in figured wood, though, a lot of times you'll mistake grain patterns for scratches. That's a scratch. That's a grain pattern. You can't sand that out. It isn't going anywhere, and it will become obvious to you as you move along the process. So, we start with 80 grit, then we jump from there to what we're using right now, which is 100 grit. And the main objective there is to pull all the scratches of the 80 grit paper off the surface, see if we can detect any small defects or blimps that we didn't see earlier when the wood was in considerably rougher shape. And if you do decide that you found a defect, oh, let's say like, I'm going to call that a defect right there. See that little stripe? See how it's contrary to everything else that you see around it? Well, that's a defect. That's where, at some point in time, with some tool, it cut a little deeper than it did around the rest of the surface. And as the surrounding surface is smoothed out, the defect has become accentuated. Well, looking at it in its current condition, in the white, it doesn't look that bad. But from experience, I can tell you that after we put stain on it, it's going to stand out like a big old blinking yellow caution light. It'll be the first thing the eye falls to, and it's probably the last thing you want people to see. So, in order to get rid of that type of issue, at this phase of the game, you've got to pay attention to the tiny stuff. You have to look really, really hard. You have to be, prudent about what you're sanding and how you're sanding it. And is it getting you to where you want to go? Now, here, this might look like a defect, but it's not. It's actually grain characteristic. See that common swirl that cuts across the growth rings? That's not a defect or a cut. That's character. You're not going to get rid of that, but you want to make sure that people can see it. So the usual process is to go from a heavy grit paper to a finer paper to a finer paper. And I've seen plenty of guys that talk about finishing gun stocks on the internet that I think get a little carried away with that. Typically, when I get ready to run one down, I'll start with 80, I'll move to 100, then I'll move to 150, and then I move to 220. And when I get to 220, well, that's it, baby. That's as fine as that stock is going to be, at least off of my hands. When we apply the stain, we'll raise the grain some, it'll feather. Has a whole different look at that point. But when we apply the final finish oil, the Danish oil, we'll do that with some 320 wet dry, and that'll knock that feather down. And you'll wind up with the kind of look you get with the Restomod. Smooth, buttery to the touch, resilient, attractive, everything you want in the gun stock. Well, that's enough for today, kids. So this is Shane Bruce with Rest of My Daisy, signing off.